Thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak to you today. It's very sad that we can't be together in person in Vienna. I'm a great believer in democracy, so based on the initial vote earlier today, I'm going to have apple strudel for my dinner. We're going to speak about lessons learned from COVID-19 and a view for the future for people with lung conditions. I was very keen that we finish the day with an optimistic view of the future, because I think we can all accept the last 6 months in particular have been very difficult for people with lung conditions. But there are always positives that we can draw from difficult times, and that's the theme I want to try and put across during these 15 minutes. I'm particularly pleased to be giving this presentation, having worked with PIPA and the ELF over many years on a number of projects. I know how important the work that they do and the work that you do as patient organisations is. Before I begin my disclosures, I do a number of clinical trials, particularly in rare diseases, bronchiectasis, with pharmaceutical companies. I always like to make sure that listeners are aware of that before hearing my talks. I'm not going to talk about drugs in particular today. So I thought I would begin by asking a question, which is, what for people with respiratory conditions do you think has been the most difficult thing about the pandemic? I've put kind of 6 options on the slide. I'm aware that there could be 60 options on this slide, but just to get a sense of where you think has been the most difficult aspect, or the thing that people with lung disease have been reporting to you as the biggest problem. Just wait a moment for the results to appear. And this will feed back into what we're going to talk about towards the end of the presentation, which is the work that ELF has done to support people through the pandemic, and very much dealing with people with lung disease's individual concerns. So I think this tracks more or less with what I'm hearing from my patients, that anxiety has been a huge issue. Not being able to access medical care has been a major issue. And lack of peer support, lack of support from other people with lung disease, as well as friends and family, has been a huge issue. But all of these things have been difficult through the last 6 months. It would be, I think, very easy for me to fill 15 minutes of this presentation with all the worries that we have about the second wave in Europe. So we know now, as you can see from the slide on the left-hand side, the rates of coronavirus are starting to increase again in Europe, and that has been challenging for everybody, including people like myself who've been on the clinical front line. But as I say, I want to switch here to thinking about what will the COVID-19 pandemic teach us that might be a benefit in the future for people with lung disease, or as the quote from Shakespeare says, in all adversity, there is potentially a precious jewel in the head, meaning that there are things that we will take out of this very difficult time that will be a benefit to everyone. And I'm going to give some examples of that. And the first one I'm going to talk about is really our change in approach to people with lung disease. On the left-hand side, you can see a graph of flu cases in Australia, which is, so we're just going into our winter in Europe, but Australia has had its winter over the last few months. And one of the striking things has been, while COVID-19 cases, of course, have happened in Australia, the rates of flu have dramatically dropped, as you can see from the orange line there, compared to 2019. We've known for decades that people with respiratory conditions like asthma, COPD, bronchiectasis, pulmonary fibrosis, suffer from exacerbations of the condition caused by viruses. And yet, in Europe, uptake of things like influenza vaccination have always been lower than the targets. And there has never been a major focus on reducing risks of infections in people with lung condition. How often have you ever spoken to, or have we as clinicians spoken to people with lung disease about getting their relatives to wash their hands and not come to visit when they have symptoms of viral infections? The impact of what we're doing at the moment in terms of social distancing and infection control is that many of my patients are saying they've had the best 6 months of their chest condition they've ever had because they've not had exposure to other viruses that are being prevented by the social distancing measures. We've taught an entire generation of children, an entire generation of adults to wash their hands and to be aware of their potential for infecting other people. And that may, in the future, have a major effect on our attitude towards respiratory infection, which are a major contributor to the morbidity and mortality of all respiratory diseases. On the right-hand side, we've changed completely how we deliver healthcare, certainly in my setting, and I think in most settings around Europe. I'm now seeing the vast majority of my patients for their review clinic appointments via electronic means. There are limitations to that, but the feedback that we get from patients is that in many cases they find it much more helpful to be able to do that electronically. It means that relatives who might not be well enough to come to the clinic are able to take part in those consultations from the patient's home. It's less disruptive to patients to be able to come to the hospital. Our rate of patients not attending for clinic appointments has plummeted because, of course, there's no longer the struggle with things like public transport. And so what COVID has done is accelerated and moved towards a kind of hybrid system where some patients will still have to attend in person, but patients in the future, I believe, will have the choice of whether they want to connect with their healthcare professional in person or electronically. And that can only be beneficial, particularly if the power to choose is put in the hands of the patients. There are a number of challenges for some of the things that we've taken for granted in respiratory disease. So we know that pulmonary rehabilitation is perhaps the most effective intervention we have for chronic conditions like COPD and bronchiectasis. And yet it's hard to imagine that we're going to get large groups of patients together, at least in the very short term. Yet this pandemic is accelerating moves towards finding innovative new ways of delivering rehabilitation and exercise, encouraging patients to exercise through electronic means, through virtual pulmonary rehabilitation, things that were very difficult to get funded and very difficult to do research into are suddenly very easy and very important because they're right at the top of the political agenda. In general, across the healthcare system, there's an attitude change from you can't do that into how can I help you to do that. Another good example is spirometry, which many patients, for example, with COPD, will be asked to attend regularly for checks of lung function at general practice or hospitals. Because of the COVID-19 situation, there's been a massive acceleration in testing and rolling out of portable equipment that can be used in patients' homes. So in future, we may deliver that kind of care in a very different way and in a way that's less inconvenient for patients. So I think while there are challenges clearly for respiratory patients, there is a sense that the COVID-19 pandemic is forcing a reevaluation of how we deliver care to respiratory patients and innovation in how we do that so that we can provide more patient-centered care in patients' homes with less asking patients to come backwards and forwards to hospitals and other healthcare settings. And that culture of can-do and innovation that has been engendered by, we had to have that in order to cope with the surge of COVID-19 cases in March and April, has been maintained now that the cases have dropped. And I hope we continue to see that focus on new ways of delivering care as we move into a different phase of the pandemic. There's one particular area where I think we've seen extraordinary innovation that is going to have lasting repercussions for how we deliver care to respiratory patients, and that's in the field of clinical trials. I think this is relevant to everyone because every patient organization on this call would love to see a new treatment developed for their condition as quickly as possible that could save lives, could improve quality of life. And the biggest barrier to that has been funding for those kinds of clinical trials and the practicalities of delivering trials that have historically been very complex and very expensive to deliver. What COVID-19 has given us, I think, is a perfect case study in how high quality clinical research can save lives. Right at the beginning of the pandemic, there was clearly a lot of clinicians who thought they knew what the right treatment was, and we've seen a lot of treatments with things like hydroxychloroquine or antibody treatments that were used by clinicians with the best of intentions based on their feeling or their understanding of data that these things would work. But the only way to really know if something works is to use randomization, because as it says here, randomization is our best friend. Randomization allows you to take two groups of people who are identical in every other respect, apart from whether they were randomly assigned to treatment A or treatment B. And it allows you to then know for certain, or as certain as you can be, that the results you then observe are the result of that treatment. And two large randomized studies have really helped us to innovate in the clinical trial space during the COVID-19 pandemic. One is the UK recovery trial. A very similar study taking place across Europe is the WHO solidarity trial. And there's also an ICU equivalent called REMAP-CAP. And they all have used the same innovative trial approach. So rather than the classic trial where you take a single drug and you take a placebo, a fake drug, and you take a highly selected patient population that's often not very representative of the patients where the drug will ultimately be used, and doing that kind of very tight trial. What's been done in these trials is to take multiple possible treatments, because we can't wait to test them one at a time, and patients have been randomized, in the case of the recovery trial, you can see here, to an antiviral, an anti-inflammatory, a hydroxychloroquine, and an antibiotic, or standard care, which is what we do for patients normally in hospital, managing to test multiple interventions at the same time in a population of patients that wasn't tightly selected. They were anybody that had COVID-19 infection in hospital. And by doing this, by doing a trial that's much more real life, much more pragmatic, and larger and quicker than any that had come before, many of you will know we have now the first medicine that's been proven to save lives with COVID-19, which is dexamethasone. And you can see the difference between the black lines and the red lines on the left-hand side of this slide are the lives that are saved as a result of dexamethasone. Trials also serve another very important purpose, which is telling us things that don't work. And they've told us that hydroxychloroquine isn't effective at reducing mortality, that antiviral medicines like lopinavir, ritonavir are not effective at reducing mortality. Why this is so important is that there's no reason why trial designs like this can't be used in COPD, in asthma, in pulmonary fibrosis, in primary ciliary dyskinesia. What this has demonstrated is that pragmatic, large-scale trial designs can deliver answers quickly and to a level that would allow changes in clinical practice that will save lives. And there's no reason why that can't then become the standard for all of the conditions that we look after in respiratory medicine. Another extraordinary innovation during the COVID-19 pandemic has been the way that we share information. And this is particularly close to my heart as an editor of one of the ERS journals, the European Respiratory Journal. The traditional method of sharing information with the scientific community is, as it shows on the slide here, you write a manuscript and then you send it to a journal who may reject or accept the manuscript. And it's a process that takes sometimes months, sometimes years. It very carefully controls the quality of manuscript, but does take time. And of course, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, time was something that we felt that we didn't have. And so there's been a significant increase in the use of preprint servers, which are essentially posting scientific information online during the COVID-19 pandemic, which has meant that results of trials have become available within a few days of those results being known to the researchers, rather than months or years as was previously the case. And there's been a big increase in the number of researchers getting onto social media platforms and other media to talk about research, meaning that the information can get to patients as quickly as possible. Now, there are obviously risks to non-peer-reviewed information getting out through these kinds of servers, but scientific societies like the ERS and experts and educational platforms are a great way of filtering that information and selecting the information that's out there that's of benefit to both patients and clinicians. And so I think this innovation is here to stay. We will see much more rapid dissemination of information to clinicians and patients in the future. And ultimately, more information has to be a good thing. And on that theme of information being a good thing, I think I've been incredibly lucky to have the opportunity to work with Pippa and Jess and others from the ELF during the pandemic on the ELF website. Very early in the pandemic, ELF recognized that there was a great need for information, and working with other partner organizations, set out a way to try and provide that information for patients. And the ERS had a resource center for COVID-19 information, which was very useful for professionals. And the website you can see on the slide was the central part of the ELF's contribution to that for patients. And this contained a lot of information for patients about COVID-19. But one of the most successful parts of the website has been a question and answer section of the website where once or twice a week, all the way through the pandemic, questions were sent to experts, including myself, Tobias Velter, Leo Hunks, and others in ERS, to answer specific questions from patients about, initially the patients wanted to know about the virus, what was likely to happen with the virus, what were the symptoms of the virus. As the pandemic moved on and patients became more aware of that, they were asking questions about how it affects different respiratory conditions. Patients were asking about their own risk of complications from COVID-19. And then we've definitely seen it shift as time's gone on to patients now asking questions about the long-term effects of COVID-19 and how things are going to develop through the winter. As a result of this resource centre and the demand that there is for information, ELF saw a large increase in the number of visits to the ELF website, but particularly a large number of patients engaging with the question and answer part of the website. And I think it's, again, thinking about what we've learned from COVID and what we can take forward from COVID, is that patients and people with respiratory conditions really value interaction with specialists rather than having a static piece of information in a leaflet. They like the opportunity to get an answer to their specific question through websites and fora such as this. And that's clearly something that we can use and we can respond to in the future, both in the COVID space, but also for any other respiratory condition where there's an information need. So I hope I've given you a sense that there will be positives that come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's try and finish on a high. What do you think is going to be the best thing that's going to come out of the COVID-19 pandemic from the point of view of our patients? So I've said a greater focus on lung disease, greater engagement of specialists with patients, such as we've seen with the website, new treatments for lung disease with those innovative trial designs, greater need of recognition of infection control and reducing infections, a change in public attitude to vaccines, which I haven't really touched on, but I think is going to be a beneficial effect of the pandemic, and or those more patient-centered ways of delivering healthcare that I've touched on. And there we go. And the top was the greater recognition of infection control and reducing infection. I think that's right. I think even if we get a vaccine tomorrow, people's attitudes towards infection control, hand washing have changed. And I think respiratory patients in the future are going to benefit from that. I also believe the top the greater focus of lung disease as a priority is important. Respiratory disease has remained massively underfunded by grant funding bodies for research, and I think that COVID, I hope, will change that as a recognition that we have made a mistake in neglecting respiratory infection in particular. But one of the most positive things is I can list at least 6 benefits, and you agree that there's at least 6 potential benefits going forward for our respiratory patients, and there will be innovations that come from COVID. So in summary, I think COVID-19's changed respiratory medicine forever. I think we will see closer interaction between myself and respiratory professionals with patients and patient organizations, because that's what we've done during COVID. We will see more innovative, more pragmatic research, and that'll mean faster treatments, not just for COVID, but for all respiratory conditions. We'll see more rapid communication and implementation of results. We'll see more care delivered in patients' homes, and that is much more likely to lead to patient-centered care and care that's controlled by patients. And I hope that we'll see a world focusing on treatments for lung disease like we've never seen before. And with that, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you.